In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Today, we have three beautiful readings. One from the Old Testament, in which we hear the people complaining again. This time, it's not for food, but it's for water. And Moses is listening to them. And what strikes me most there is that the reading ends with the people questioning the presence of God. And I did a whole sermon a few weeks ago on the presence of God. If you remember, we had this beautiful Psalm 139 sung, and we talked about the presence of God. And the major point I tried to make there was that when we begin to understand the presence of God in our lives, then our own autonomy goes out the window. Because the psalmist, if you remember, says, "Where can I flee from your spirit?" There's nowhere we can go without having God be present there. The next reading today from the New Testament is Paul writing to Philippi. And we talked a little about the context of that, where Paul is in a jail cell and he's writing this, and he's asking this church to stay on the message, to be committed to the purpose and mission of God. And today also he's doing the same thing. And he is saying, if there is any consolation in love, if there is anything that you can offer, be of one mind. And how do you do that? By actually doing what happens when we understand the presence of God, which is not our own wills, but understanding God's purpose and mission. So not through selfish ambition, as he says, not through what I want, but through what God is seeking. And so he ends that with talking about Jesus as the role model for that. That Jesus actually did that. Even though he was God, he humbled himself. He did not exploit that equality with God, but humbled himself for what? For the mission of God, so that God's will would be done. So he says that's the oneness of mind, right? That it's not about we all getting together and deciding on something and that be the oneness of mind. The oneness of mind is to actually be one with the mission of God. And then the gospel. I love that gospel because here is Jesus doing something really fascinating. People come to him and say, question his authority. Because, that often happens to good leaders, right? When they are being able to affect change, when things begin to happen, when transformation begins to happen, when the status quo is disrupted, when things actually begin to happen, what's the next question people have? Who gave this guy this authority to do these things? We were very happy with how things were. Who gave this guy the authority to come in and change? And so Jesus's work is having an impact on people's lives, and what they can think of as human beings. Who gave you this authority? And I love it because Jesus throws them into a conundrum, right? Because I say Jesus is smart, right? So he throws them into a conundrum, and these people are like, oh, if we say this, then he will say, well, why didn't you believe in him? Right? And if we say no of human origin, then we have to deal with social pressure. There are so many people who actually like John and believe and follow him. What are we going to do about them? Well, no good options. So what do? We say, oh, I don't know. Right? And well, we would think that the story has ended there. But the story has not ended there. It's not like Jesus threw them into a conundrum because Jesus was dodging a question and Jesus didn't want them to actually know a response. Jesus says, what do you think? There was a man with two sons. He asks one of them to go and work on the vineyard, and he says yes and then doesn't do it. The other one says no and then does it. So the question is, who did the will of God? And the point once again being, not how people talk, but as my professor would say, Professor Herzog, how people walk. It's not about God talk, because sometimes we can stand here and say really wonderful, but how are we walking? Are we preaching the gospel and then making sure that no and nothing new, no new life emerges in our faith communities? Think about it. We hear wonderful sermons, and when it comes to really committing ourselves to the change, the transformation, inner transformation of our hearts, that would bring about joy and peace and healing and new life, and oh my God, new people into our midst, we all like say, no. That's pushing it too much, right? So the question that Paul would ask, because the question that Jesus is asking is, what is better? What is better? To just have a belief system that we just say, oh yeah, I believe, or a belief system in which we give our everything to follow and do the work that God has called us to do. Now, for some of you, the sermon may have ended here. But you know I have time, so. But here's the thing that I think is really important to see. Because this is a great opportunity. I have always loved this story of Moses and the people complaining about water. It has fascinated me from very early days of my life. Because unlike wanting meat, right? Last week it was all about give us some meat. You know, we had these flesh pots back in Egypt. Unlike that, which is sort of like, you know, longing for really nice things, right? Unlike that, this story is about the basics. Water. You can't live without water. So what people are asking is not an invalid request. You know, flesh pots, okay, you can eat, you know, fruits and vegetables as you are moving along, but or have an animal once in a while. But water is essential. It's essential to life. So what they're asking for is something very, very basic and essential. It's not really a complaint that can be ignored. In fact, in the book of Numbers, in chapter 20, this story reappears, but with a different kind of twist to it. Some may argue that this was the second time people complained for water. I don't know. Or some may, this is the same story that appears the second time with a different twist. Whichever camp you are in, I'm fine with that. But the story in Numbers becomes the cause of Moses not being able to enter the promised land. Right? And there's a difference between the two stories. That's not the topic today. But here is the topic today. Leadership. Leadership does not ignore complaints. Good leadership does not ignore complaints. And good leadership does not form its response only on the complaint. You see, when good leaders hear a complaint, they like to sift it and say, okay, what am I actually hearing? Because people can complain. We all do that, right? It's a human reaction to things. If we are human beings, we have emotions. And emotions come out. But that doesn't always mean that what we are saying is exactly what is bothering us or is exactly what needs to be fixed. Right? So I have this story from my dad's ministry. And this used to fascinate, still does fascinate me. And I think I've shared it with St. Paul's people before, that a young man who had a PhD from Princeton in theology and politics came back to Pakistan. And my dad was really interested in getting him into the ministry in Pakistan. And so he was, he took him to one of his Episcopal visits. And, all the way they talked theology because he had just come out of this theology program. And, so they get to that village. The villagers, welcome them. And then they have the worship service. And as is the custom in Pakistan in a village, when the bishop is there, and it's kind of the custom here also, but it's a little more pronounced in that context, where the bishop would sit with the people. And the people would bring all kinds of problems to the bishop. And the bishop listens to them and almost acts like a justice, right? So listens to all of that and tries to help them sort things in their community. And so he's doing that. And there is one older gentleman, and he stands up and complains about this guy, this young man, that the church had hired to run the tube well in the village. Because this tube well was owned by the church, and this young man was hired by the church to run that tube well. And this older gentleman stood up and said, this young man is not doing his job, and he is really creating a lot of problems for people because people are not getting water in time. And if you understand agriculture, timing of when you are going to water is extremely important. So, that was a problem. And he kept on pressing his point, pressing his complaint. And one point, my dad stood up and asked the older gentleman to come forward. And he came forward and he said, okay, you have my seat here. Come and sit in this seat. And he said, why? And he said, no, come and sit it. So my dad sat him in his seat and he said, now you be the judge and you give whatever punishment you want to give to this young man. Okay? If you want him fired, fire him. Whatever you wish to do with him, do it. The young man, the older gentleman got out of that seat this quick, and everybody started laughing. And that was it. On the way back home, this Princeton graduate in theology and political science, with a PhD from there, just was so puzzled at this. And he said, Bishop, I have a question. What happened there? And my dad said, what happened? And he said, you never answered their question, and everybody laughed, and that was the end of that complaint. And my dad said, you see, you did not know one thing. That young man that we had hired to run the tube well was that older gentleman's grandson. Right? And the grandfather wanted him to do everything the grandfather wanted him to do, and the grandson was laying down the rules and saying, no, Grandpapa, it's not just for you. This tube well is not just for you. And he said the grandfather was not going to fire the grandson, right? So the complaint was not exactly about the proper distribution of water. The complaint was, my grandson is not listening to me. Right? And good leaders understand that. Good leaders have, the first principle is, you try to know your people. That's the most important thing. Jesus said, my sheep know my voice. And Jesus knows his sheep. That is the relationship with Jesus Christ that we talk about. And in this case, Moses is called to that kind of leadership, to sift through it. Does God ignore their request? No. God says, all right, take that staff and there will be water for them to have. Because that's a legitimate request. Forget how they are complaining and giving you a hard time. That's not the point. Sift through that and take care of the actual problem. Now, I would also like to point out here, I was watching this college's program on leadership, where they bring young people from high schools into the college and put them with great leaders, industry leaders, and then later on after college put them again with, and they had a tagline which was really interesting. And their tagline was, we believe leadership is caught, not taught. Leadership is caught, not taught. Now, I think we often overlook the fact that God created this opportunity for Moses to grow up in under Pharaoh's direct presence, to catch leadership. We forget that Moses' father-in-law was a leader in his community, in his own religious community. And Moses listened to him on the principles of leadership. Now, why speak about that? Well, I think it's relevant because these days we are really in a place in this country. We are thinking about leadership, right? Elections are not too far in the future. We are thinking about leadership. Oftentimes, when we are thinking about leadership, we end up thinking about leadership from the perspective of the peer pressure. What is our peer group saying about it? And we don't stop and think about, okay, if I am the leader, through all this that I'm hearing, can I sift through all of that and really develop an understanding of what the situation is? And then what my response to that situation should be. You see, I often say there's a difference between how a leader approaches a situation and how a non-leader approaches a situation. A leader approaches a situation and tries to understand what are the boundaries in which that leader has to work and really understand the context, right? So, for instance, my good friend and classmate, Pastor Michael Walrand, shared this example at our mission conference that he was at a workshop for leadership. And they gave people freedom to just exercise their creativity. They gave them certain things and they had to build certain things, and they weren't able to do a whole lot. But then they put restrictions around what they could do, and all of a sudden the same people became extremely creative. You see, that is the basics of leadership. That a good leader has to understand what is it that I'm working in? What context am I working in? And then given that context, then apply creativity and say, okay, what am I going to do in this situation? Just like Jesus did. Jesus didn't say, oh, let me talk to you about authority. No, Jesus understood the context in which he was being put, and he responded accordingly. Right? And so a leader's job is to understand the boundaries. And if I may say so, a non-leader response is to question the boundaries. You see, questioning the boundary can be a wonderful exercise, but a questioning the boundary may not give you the opportunity to solve the problem. You can spend all the time questioning the boundary and not really apply yourself in solving the problem. Moses could have done the same thing, but Moses, with God present there, solved the problem. So, here's what I share with you today. I believe each and every person is a leader because you are leading your life. No one else but you make the choices for your life that you do. You are a leader. You are a leader and you make the choices for yourself. In the end, even if you decide to go with the social pressure, you are making that decision. You are leading your own life. So leadership principles are applicable to every one of us. And the best thing to do is, first of all, yes, understand that God is present, and then to do what God, through Jesus, says to us today. Paul says, same thing. Stay on the message. Do, not just speak. Not just say, okay, I will do it, and then don't do it. Do the will of God. And whenever we start making that choice, and that choice only comes when we give up our own ambitions and start to analyze the whole context and make decisions that are really good and transformative for everyone. May the Lord God give us the capacity to find God's presence as we lead our lives.